It's a privilege to be here to give this first Lucas Memorial talk. Some caveats before we begin. I'm not a historian. I'm using the resources readily available to me to put this talk together. I want to give you an overview of medicine and pharmacy in the 19th century. I'm going to focus on some of the writings of key characters in that time period. So we'll come to them in turn as we go through the talk. Before we look at their writings, might just have a quick look at a Materia Medica from 1831 to set the scene and see what the therapeutic armory was like at that stage. So reading through this Materia Medica, it was an English translation of a French Materia Medica that was felt to be far ahead of its UK contemporaries at the time. Reading through it, there was analogies between the colour of the drug and the activity that it may have. They described most of the drugs by taste, so obviously they had limited analytical capabilities. There was a basic understanding of chemistry. They described the fact that there were 50 known simple substances at the time, focusing on the few that were used in medicine, so sulfur, iodine, iron, mercury, and chlorine used as a disinfectant at times. You can see the general principles of the text where it was this process of counter-irritation, or when acute inflammation exists in any organ, to create a more lively irritation in another part of the economy or the body will diminish the intensity of their first affection and may dissipate it completely. And you'll see that throughout the talk. Give the patient something else to worry about, and they certainly did that. There was some prescient elements to the text, so here they're advocating the scientific method to build the knowledge base in therapeutics. They're talking against the times not very far remote where it was the great name that promoted a specific treatment, and whatever they professed went unexamined and unquestioned and was acted upon. And this had been going on for millennia, and medicine was in a state that had been handed down from Greek times. They have an awareness of what's coming later in the century, so they acknowledge the fact that they have imperfect instruments, but postulate that there are modifying agents out there that can act in a predictable way, in a uniform manner, and that diseases will be rendered less formidable and more often are cured. In terms of their classification of remedies, this is from the table of contents. There's broad categories. A lot of these we wouldn't recognize from a pharmacopoeia today. Caustics would decompose tissues chemically. They'd result in local or circumscribed gangrene, be used as an alternative to surgery in some cases. Rubefacients and epispastics. Rubefacients were products that would cause local irritation, and they'd be used to produce blisters. And then the suppuration from those blisters would be a way of drawing out toxins. So Spanish fly extract, which contained cantharidin, would be one of the ways of inducing those blisters. Astringents would be medicines that had a constriction effect when applied to living tissues. Styptics would have fallen within this category, so drugs that reduce bleeding. They have a section on sulfate of iron, which is like the Moncel solution that's still used in cervical procedures to stop bleeding. They talk about tonics and very broad descriptions of what tonics do, so they increase the energy of the organs. And one of the tonics they talk about is the Peruvian bark or Jesuit's bark, the cinchona species, which contain quinine. So they had an awareness of quinine and its activities. They discuss how it has a remarkable effect on intermittent diseases, which were the malarial diseases were called at the time. And infallibly, it will prevent the periodical return of fevers associated with these affections. The stimulants then were categorized as general or special. Within the special group, mercury got quite a lot of attention and was used, and we'll see that in some of the case reports we'll look at in a few minutes. Alcohol was in there, obviously, as a stimulant. Digitalis was there. They were talking about, in very small doses, it causes less frequent and less violent contraction of the heart. They talked about high doses and how they describe quite accurately the signs of digitalis toxicity. The other sections then within the narcotics, there was quite an extensive entry on the papaver somniferum or the opium poppy, and a good knowledge of how it worked and the adverse effects. There's 60 pages on emetics, purgatives, and laxatives. So it's one of the biggest sections of the Materia Medica, and you can see from how they treated disease that this was a big focus for them. Handy dosing table there. I spend a lot of time in neonatal intensive care unit as part of my job, and if it was this simple, it'd be great. But they had a concept of toxicology and dose-response effect and the need to alter doses at extremes of age. Moving on then to Dr. Corrigan, and this is the kind of Materia Medica that would have been around in his time. One of his most famous contributions to the literature around permanent patency of the mouth of the aorta. He shows that, at this stage in the 1830s, that cardiac disease has been neglected and the scientific principles haven't been applied, and that modern medicine is not helping these patients. He criticized the extant approach to cardiac disease. So contemporaries of his would have recommended bleeding and starving. So essentially bleed the patient to remove toxins and starve the patient to decrease the muscle mass of the heart. So that starvation would diminish the cardiac hypertrophy, and they postulated that that would relieve the symptoms. He recommended a generous diet, abstinence from alcohol, normal activities as much as possible, and try to disabuse the patients of the notion that they'd suffered from a sudden cardiac death. Because in his case series, he hadn't seen that. So I don't expect that anyone will be able to read this, but it's just an illustration of one of the patients, one of the cases that he took umbrage with. So this was a young man who was diagnosed with heart disease. He submitted to the conventional treatment course. So bleeding after bleeding, blister after blister were repeated, starvation enforced, digitalis exhibited, until the patient was reduced to such a weakness that he had scarcely strength to raise himself from the bed. And upon being very close to death, they held off on the treatment regimen because they felt that they'd lost this case. And then from that hour, the patient got better and his muscular strength returned. The embarrassment of breathing, palpitation, cough, etc. became less and less urgent. The patient is still alive, disease is still present, but with full living and good air, he's able not only to take considerable exercise, but even to undergo the fatigue of a business that constantly requires very laborious efforts. So you can see there he had a knowledge of the pathology of the condition. He questioned the extant approach to it, and he implemented an evidence-based approach to how he treated his patients, and they fared better than those of his contemporaries. In 1840, we've got another treatise here on observations on the treatment of acute rheumatism, and he's focusing on opium use in this condition. He's criticizing one of his contemporaries' approaches. And it's essentially a similar approach to the humoral model of medicine. In this case, for acute rheumatic disorders, they're using the same treatment as for heart disease. So the patients are harmed by the bleeding course or coups, so bleeding every time or repeatedly, cupping, tight bandaging, blisters, and mercurial cerates. So Boulud uses all of these adjuvants, and his patients don't fare well for it. He advocated opiates in generous doses, and local measures to relieve the pain and the swelling. Looking at some of the cases, so the first was a young girl who went to Jervis Street Hospital on the 8th of March, who had been ill for 7 days and was unable to turn in the bed, and who had symptoms across on her wrists and multiple joints. His initial treatment was calomel, which is a mercury chloride product, and opium in ascending doses, and purgatives. So there were some elements of the practice that were quite similar to what was going on at the time, but this idea of giving generous doses of opium and managing the pain was novel. One of his later cases was a friend of his, Dr. Aldridge. Dr. Aldridge didn't get the mercury compound, the calomel, it was just opium alone. He, in the paper describing these cases, Dr. Aldridge wrote to Dr. Corrigan and described his experience of it. He talked about sleeping much, though his intellect remained clear, except occasionally when I took an overdose of opium. And he said that as soon as he began to experience its good effects, he became quite enamored of it. Corrigan was a household name, so we've Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management, very important reference text, and Corrigan's button is mentioned within Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management for the treatment of lumbago. So Corrigan's button was an iron disc about 1/2 inch in diameter. The protocol involved holding it over a spirit lamp with your index finger about 1 inch from the button. And once it was too hot for you to hold your index finger there, take it off and then lightly touch it over an area of skin where the lumbago is or whatever the condition was. And essentially with this process, you could fire a whole limb in about 100 places in approximately a minute. So very pleasant process, but it's, again, this notion of counter-irritation, and it's kind of prescient of the gate theory of pain as well. Before we move on from Corrigan, I don't have time to go into it, but he gives a really nice description of his experience body snatching in his student days. So going to the burial grounds in the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, he describes how they used to expose the head of the coffin. They had a rope with a hook on the end of it. They'd get that down, crack the lid of the coffin. Then one of them would have to go down the shaft and put the rope around the cadaver's neck and pull them out. They had to leave the shroud after them, because if they took the shroud, they'd be committing a crime. They'd be stealing the shroud. But there's a nice description of it on that site. So moving on then to a later arrival on the Dublin School of Medicine to William Wilde. So he was born in Castlereagh in 1815 and the son of a country doctor, probably an apothecary. We can see here his entry in the RCSI Roll of Licentiates. This is 1837, 16th of March 1837. He's the top entry there, William Robert Wilde, Stephen's Hospital. A contemporary of his was Robert Thompson, and he left a description of what it was like in his student days. He has a diary that's been published. So Thompson and Wilde were apprenticed to Abraham Collis. There was 30 apprentices living in Dr. Stephen's at the time, and they seemed to have had a good time there. They were on site when they heard the accident bell. They'd run down to the front hall to see what was coming through, and Thompson describes seeing in all their original freshness fractures, cut throats, burns, head injuries, poisonings, lacerated wounds, and crushed limbs. So, good place to train. In terms of the model of medicine in 1832 and what Wilde was learning while he was in college, you know, the Hippocratic humoral theory was still extant, that we've got 4 components of the body: the blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile, and that it's imbalances in these elements that leads to disease, and that you can rebalance them by bleeding, blistering, and violent purgation. And surgery at the time wasn't much better. They had limited analgesics, so they had alcohol and opium to work with, and speed was essential. There's the apocryphal tale of Robert Liston, which I can find no actual reference to support, but the tale is that he was able to amputate a leg in about 2.5 minutes. And in one of these operations, he took off his assistant's finger, and he also slashed one of the eminent surgeons nearby him, slashed his coat. So his assistant died of gangrene. His patient died of gangrene. The assistant subsequently died of sepsis. And the observer of the operation, whose coat was slashed, had a heart attack and died on the spot. So it's the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He also removed the patient's testicles along with the patient's leg in a very eager operation. So what Wilde was heading out into as he qualified, these are the tools of the trade in terms of the bleeding, the blistering, and the violent purgation. So the mustard plaster there, it's probably not of Wilde's time, it's probably an early 20th century package, but the general approach was with whatever rubefacient or irritant you use, you apply it to a particular area. It generates a blister that then exudes pus, and that is then pulling out some of the toxins. So the mustard plaster approach. Leeches were very commonly used. One reference source estimated that there's 5 million leeches imported into England in 1824 and 41 million into France in 1833. So there's huge volumes of leeches being used, and they were used for local as opposed to general bleeding, which we can touch on in a few minutes. Cupping then was another approach, and there was wet and dry cupping. The one at the top here, if I can get my pointer up. So this would have been one of the earlier sets. Essentially, these cups would have been used with a flame source to generate a vacuum, and it would then suck the skin up into the cup. That would encourage blood flow into that area. That cupping may be combined with scarification of that area that's under the cup. So this device here is a scarifier. Essentially, it's a 7 or 8 blade device that is used to score the skin under the cup. So the cup is taken off, the skin is scored, and then the cup is put back on to draw blood from that particular site. Technological advances, this is one of the later kits. So you've got a syringe that's attached to the cup, and you don't need to mess around with a fire source to generate the vacuum. Anyone watching the Olympics would have seen Michael Phelps and a few other people with cupping scars on them, so this quackery is still out there. It fell out of regular practice because of the conventional medicine adapted the scientific approach, and medical statistics destroyed these kind of practices broadly. So Wilde, I don't want to spend too much time on Wilde because we're limited in terms of time, but he did experience the cholera epidemic of 1832. He was sent west to be safe and get away from Dublin, and he ended up hitting Kilmaine at the time of an outbreak, and he looked after a patient who subsequently died. But the reports of that involved him burning the patient's possessions and preventing contamination locally. Incidentally, Bram Stoker's mother would have experienced the same outbreak around the same neck of the woods, and her tales to her son then in the early 1850s might have been an inspiration for Dracula. So Wilde went on then to the Rotunda. He studied midwifery in the Rotunda in the late 1830s. He won the annual research prize. He signed on in RCSI on the 16th of March. And at that stage, he had to leave Dublin in a hurry because he may have gotten a young lady in trouble. There isn't a huge amount of detail on it, but he accompanied a convalescent patient on a cruise in the Mediterranean. So he visited abroad, quite an extensive cruise, and visited the Middle East as well. And he published the narrative of this voyage, and it was sold a lot of copies, generated a nice bit of revenue for him. In that, he describes, what he saw. He went to visit local hospitals on his travels, so he describes the Latin monastery in Palestine. And I suppose one of the striking things is that the knowledge of those persons in medicine and surgery is just in the state in which we received it from the monks about 3 centuries ago. But that the stocks of medicines were very good in that dispensary. He describes a pharmacy in Egypt as well, and was very impressed in terms of the scale and the cleanliness of it, and that it was similar to English establishments. He used the funds from that trip to fund his own trip to Vienna, where it was a mecca for surgery and medicine at the time, and he wanted to go and learn about new techniques in oral and ophthalmic surgery. And he gives a good description of the full extent of medical practice in the city. He doesn't just focus on his own area. He gives a lot of interesting observations on the maternity services, and was surprised that doctors didn't consider puerperal fever infectious, because that was his experience in the Rotunda, and the approach to puerperal sepsis in Ireland was different to Vienna. He was surprised that there was no precautions to check spread of puerperal sepsis, so he described that there was no cleansing, fumigating, whitewashing, or shutting up certain wards when puerperal sepsis has prevailed. He also witnessed a newly delivered woman placed in a bed scarcely yet cold, in which a death from puerperal sepsis fever had taken place not 2 hours earlier. So this was something that struck him. He described the bodies of the puerperal sepsis victims in the mortuary, that they were a sad spectacle even among the vast throngs of breathless carcasses. And they would have had extensive and deep blister marks on the inside of the thighs. So this was, again, this notion that we can apply blisters, we can draw out this toxin, we can treat these patients. And obviously there was a lot of suffering in that process for a patient undergoing sepsis. He showed a lot of insight in his writings, and he wasn't impressed by the professors of obstetrics who were there at the time. And I suppose he's comparing them to their Dublin counterparts. Neither of the professors, he felt, had done much to advance the science that they profess. Looking at the Rotunda at the time, this book of the Rotunda Hospital describes the mastership of Collins, which would have run 26 through to 1826 through to 1833. So Wilde would have been aware of this and would have practiced in the hospital shortly after this time. But in this time, Collins instituted a range of measures, which we'll look at in a few minutes, but essentially dropped the puerperal sepsis rate quite significantly and the overall mortality rate during his mastership. He describes it in his publication in 1841, and I don't expect you to read it, but essentially, when there was an outbreak, the board of the hospital decided that people shouldn't be admitted unless they're absolutely destitute. So, to what extent that they could, they cared for people in their own homes. They supplied patients with gruel, whey, and medicine from the charity itself. They closed all the affected wards in rotation, filled them with chlorine gas. They left it in the space for 48 hours with all of the doors and windows shut to seal in the gas as far as possible. Then they covered the floors and everywhere with the chloride of lime, freshly painted everything. They took the blankets, the bedding, mattresses, and they stoved them at between 120 and 130 degrees. So pretty good infection control processes for the time, and an awareness of the theory of contagion that was more prevalent in the UK and Ireland at the time than on the continent. If we look at the 1831 Materia Medica, it describes chloride of lime, and it says that, like chlorine itself, it has the remarkable property of decomposing putrid miasmata. It's commonly used at present with the greatest advantage for washing dissecting rooms, putrefied subjects which are to be opened, and to destroy the smell of bad privies. So chloride of lime was something that was used in the Rotunda and that he was aware of, Wilde would have been aware of. While in Austria, Wilde met Semmelweis. So apparently they knew each other well and they corresponded for years, according to a biography from a biography called Victorian Doctor. Semmelweis discovered the cause of puerperal fever about 7 years after Wilde's trip to Austria. Looking at the publication itself, I'm not going to expose you to my German, but essentially it's very long, convoluted, difficult to read treatise on puerperal sepsis. There's a copy of it here in the college. It was given to the college by the family of Fleetwood Churchill, who was a Dublin obstetrician at the time, and Churchill was given it by Dr. Wilde. So Semmelweis would have sent Wilde a copy of, or copies of this to distribute to the local obstetricians to improve practice. He had planned on visiting the Rotunda and had begun learning English to move to Rotunda, or to Dublin briefly, to look at their infection control processes, but his own discoveries took over and he couldn't make that trip. In terms of if people are interested in the puerperal sepsis story, Sherwin Newland's book is spectacular and goes into quite a degree of detail and why Semmelweis failed in his effort to communicate his message. It's incredible the process he went through and how he identified the link and the kind of statistical work that he did around it. Essentially, one of the key moments was a friend of his dying, an anatomist who cut his finger during the post-mortem on a puerperal sepsis victim and went on to develop the signs of puerperal sepsis himself in the subsequent days. So that was something that helped the penny to drop. But he did produce tables that demonstrated the association between the onset of pathological anatomy in Vienna and the increase in the incidence of puerperal sepsis. So Klein, who was the professor of obstetrics that Wilde was unimpressed with, took up his post in 1823, and he instituted pathological anatomy within that part of the hospital. His predecessor, Bohr, had trained in London and would have been more of the UK and Ireland school of thought, where women's bodies weren't used for instruction. They used painted wooden models instead. So this graph takes data from the Rotunda Hospital and data from the University Hospital in Vienna, and you can see the broad disparity there in the mortality rates between the two and the association between the beginning of pathological anatomy in the early 1820s and the increase in the puerperal sepsis rate. So Wilde returned to Ireland and opened St. Mark's Ophthalmic Hospital, focusing on diseases of the eye and ear. He wanted to be an international destination like Austria, where there's excellence in terms of management of eye and ear diseases, and he was concerned about the degree of exposure of these patients to quacks and charlatans. He funded the building of the hospital himself, and he took as its basis the principles of pathology, and by reducing treatment to recognize rules of modern therapeutics and scientific surgery. So having a pathological basis and trying to implement rational therapeutics where possible. And he leaves great descriptions of the processes he went through. He described his management of specific conditions in quite detailed papers in the Dublin Medical Journal. And he also went into detail around the quackery that was used at the time. So he introduced atropine into routine practice, and this paper in Ireland, this paper describes his initial experience of it. He famously did the squint surgery on the father of George Bernard Shaw. And Shaw disliked both, Wilde himself particularly, because his father squinted the other way all the rest of his life after the surgery. And there's a description of Wilde and how incongruous he was with his glamorous wife when they were seen out in public, that he was like the great unwashed. And he described him as being like Frederick the Great, beyond soap and water. So the blindness, the ophthalmological side of things, I haven't found I haven't basically gone into many of his ophthalmological publications, but this book is spectacular in terms of describing what it's like to be blind in the 19th century. It's a book about James Holman, who was a naval sergeant in the 1820s who went blind in his early 20s. Ultimately traveled the world, circumnavigated the globe a few times as a solo traveler, blind solo traveler, but incredible tale. But within his book, blindness was one of the diseases where quack treatments and non-evidence-based treatments can do great damage to the individual. And the kind of treatments that were described in this book that Holman underwent some of these, leeches, localized bleeding around the eye with leeches, or general bleeding with opening of a larger vessel, introduction of a ceton or a horsehair into the eye to draw out toxins, local poultices or ointments, very effective thrice weekly head shaving and cold water dunking. That's something you see in the maternity hospitals as well. There are reports of the treatment of preeclampsia back in the day. Head shaving, cold water dunking, and tar coating of the head was a routine approach in some cases. Mercury, ever present, couching, or forcing the lens of the eye down, so that if there was a cataract there, it doesn't sound like a pleasant procedure anyway from my unqualified eyes. And coction then, which is basically wait and see, does it resolve in and of itself. Wilde left a nice description in the Dublin Journal of Medical Science of his approach to otorrhea. It's quite an extensive paper that goes through all the quack treatments that were extant at the time. So the poor person with otorrhea would get hot oil, turpentine, essential oils, everything and anything unmercifully dropped into the ear. Might get a large clove of garlic thrust in, or a poultice of a roasted onion, or a piece of salt fat bacon. Purgatives were obviously beneficial. A blister behind the ear, so blisters using tincture of canthardus, which we can touch on in a minute, a variety of other very irritant compounds, and then an issue inserted into the arm. So an issue would be for bleeding, which he gives his opinion on in a minute, and sea bathing, very therapeutic, and then nitrate of silver to actually cauterize or burn off scar tissue as it forms in the ear as the infection persists and causes damage. So he describes all that process, and then he says, notwithstanding all this doctoring in the dark, the disease generally progresses, and at some stage, small bits of bone emerge from the ear, and the patient is permanently deafened. And some of these cases went on to meningitis and other worse outcomes. The Wellcome Trust have some images of folk remedies at the time for otorrhea. So this is a lady pricking a snail and dropping the snail juices into the ear canal because of snail's well-known therapeutic activities. Another one was blowing smoke into the ear. So you can see the rotund physician or apothecary blowing smoke into the patient's ear. The patient looks a bit dubious. that wasn't the only place that they blew smoke at the time. So Collis, who would have been Wilde, so Wilde would have been apprenticed to Collis in Stevens, but there were smoke enemas used and described in the literature at the time, and thankfully anaesthesia came along and got rid of that. So Wilde is asking, why aren't all these quack treatments used in other settings? So Corrigan had, brought some rationality to the management of cardiac disease, and Wilde is looking at his domain and wondering why all the quackery. This isn't used for other parts of the body. It's not injection to the eye or to the urethra, so why can't we sort this out? His approach wasn't as, it didn't have all the same quack approaches. I won't go through them all individually. He did practice local bleeding. He wasn't that keen on general bleeding. So the local bleeding would be produced with leeches placed behind the ear, essentially to put cotton wool in the ear to stop the leech from going in. Counter-irritation, so use croton oil, iodine, tartar medic, and fly blisters. Fly blisters are essentially powdered Spanish fly, which produces canthardins, which are severe skin irritants. Spanish fly is also a folk cure for the want of venereal passion. He also used local disinfectants, so like a silver nitrate solution, partly to remove some of the scar tissue, but also as a disinfectant. He talks about regular syringing. Where there's a smell to the discharge, he talks about using chloride of lime to remove the disagreeable smell. With regard to drains and counter-irritation, he occasionally inserts an issue into the arm, so he occasionally practices general bleeding, but he's doing it more for the sake of the friends or the medical attendants than for what he believes to work. And he advocates the vesicating liniment behind the ears, keeping up that counter-irritation until it's resolved. So we move on briefly to anaesthesia, which is probably one of the biggest advances in that era, and it came into practice in Wilde's time. In the 16th of October 1846, we have William Thomas Green Morton there holding his ether inhaler, and he's assisting Bigelow, who's a famous Boston surgeon at Mass General, in their theatre in the Bullfinch building, and that theatre is now known as the Ether Dome as a consequence of that famous first demonstration of the use of ether. In the following year then we have James Young Simpson. Incidentally, the first British use of ether was Robert Liston, so he was ahead of the queue, and about 6 weeks after its use in Boston, he used it in UCL in December 1846. Simpson wasn't that keen on ether, and there's a famous party in his house on the 4th of November 1847 where they got a variety of volatile chemicals and just inhaled them to see what the effects were, and they settled on chloroform as the favoured anaesthetic. Obviously broadly popularised by Queen Victoria's use of it at one of her deliveries in 1853. A contemporary of Wilde's died from chloroform experimentation, so similar age to Wilde, and he was experimenting with chloroform and prussic acid and died as a consequence. Wilde did use it for eyelid surgery, but for some procedures he preferred to have a cooperative patient and didn't use it, which is quite astounding. He published on its use as well in a difficult case where they couldn't reduce a dislocated hip, and he procured some chloroform and described it. And obviously it played a role in his own trial, but we don't really have time to go into that. There was correspondence between Wilde and Young Simpson. So Wilde describing the use of chloroform in Dublin shortly after Young Simpson's initial description of it. They corresponded on homeopathy. Wilde had written in a positive light about homeopathy from his time in Vienna and its use in the management of cholera. Young Simpson was a staunch opponent of homeopathy, so Wilde later relented, and he regretted the article that he'd written, and he assured Simpson that notwithstanding the patronage of the Archbishop of Dublin, homeopathy may be said to be defunct in the Irish metropolis. Other letters then, I don't really have time to go into detail on them, so we better move on to some of the final characters, and a lot of this relates to pain relief as well and promoting effective surgery. So top left, we've William Stewart Halstead, born in New York in 1852. Bottom right, we've Richard John Hall, an Irishman, left Ireland when he was 12 and moved to New York and trained in the US. Two of them would have traveled fairly extensively in Europe, would have traveled to Vienna, and they both developed an interest in cocaine after an initial description of the ocular use of cocaine to anesthetize the cornea. If we go back a bit further, we could see that there was a Jesuit from the 1650s who had a manuscript describing life in the New World, and he talked about chewing coca leaves to relieve toothaches. And here we can see a patent medicine, cocaine toothache drops, using the same principle. So Halstead and Hall became aware of some European work around corneal anaesthesia with topical cocaine solution. They then started experimenting to demonstrate regional anaesthesia through a variety of different types of nerve blocks and intradermal infiltration. They described the efficacy of the more dilute solutions than what they started out with, and also how to localize the effect in the particular limb. Unfortunately, both Hall and Halstead got addicted to cocaine during their experimentation, and a broader circle of their students and colleagues who were involved in that work. There's reports of cocaine injection improving the quality of theatre performances that they went to and the stimulant effects of it. So this is one of their reports. This is from the New York Medical Journal from 1886. It was a publication from Richard Hall, and he described their process of experimentation, the experiments that he did with Halstead. They experimented on themselves to determine the best mode of using it, and they said that it's obvious that when the limits of safety have been determined, it might find very wide application. They thrust a pin through their lip and found that they couldn't feel anything of it. Halstead subsequently published, but he was in the depths of cocaine addiction at the time. Ultimately, he was treated with morphine and went on to develop a lifelong morphine dependence. And in some of the history of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, where he was one of the 4 leading lights, it turned out that he had been on morphine for the rest of his career. So he was using the guts of 200 milligrams of morphine a day to stabilize himself. Despite that, he was a keen advocate of asepsis. He revolutionized medical training and the aseptic approach to surgery, and introduced rubber gloves in surgery as well. Our final character then is Augustus Beer, who performed the first spinal anesthesia in 1889. He did it on a patient first, and then they did a little bit of self-experimentation, himself and a friend of his. He insulted all anaesthetists in his paper. Sorry if there's any anaesthetists within the audience. They did it in patients first, and then they needed to refine the procedure. So his colleague, Dr. Hildebrand, tried to get into the intrathecal space on him, but the syringe didn't fit the needle. So he did it on Dr. Hildebrand. This is the effect. So at 7 minutes, they couldn't feel a needle prick in the thigh. They got as far as testicle tugging. They couldn't feel that either. So they felt they had a good demonstration of efficacy. And then they went and dined and drank wine and smoked cigars. But they both had severe post-dural puncture headache in the subsequent days. So the end piece then is, where did the Materia Medica get to? And this is my Materia Medica from 1909 that a friend bought me. There's new concepts coming in. IV drug administration is starting to emerge, done rarely, but useful where the patient is in collapse to give a saline solution. Cigarettes, a new form of drug delivery. Cataphoresis, so using electrical signals or electrical currents to pull ionic drugs across the skin. Looking at the contents, it looks more like what we'd think of today in terms of therapeutic drug classification by body systems. They split it into inorganic and organic materia medica. They describe the limitations of they understand the limitations of the materia medica at that point in time. So they have these very general terms like alterative and a tonic. and they're a bit exasperated with where they are. An alternative is something that alters the body systems with no description of how it works, and they push for the future pharmacological process that we see during the century. This is a time as well when new patent drugs are coming online. So Bayer would have launched aspirin and heroin within a short time period, kind of around 1898. You can see heroin being advertised there as the sedative of choice for coughs, called heroin because the people who were first given it felt heroic. And that's the talk.